All right, welcome back to the TBD with TLG podcast. It's the To Be Determined podcast with Trowbridge Law Group. This is Jonathan Nieh. I'm one of the founding partners at Trowbridge Law Group, and I'm here with my partner, the Mr. Gene Trowbridge.
Hi, Jonathan. It's a lovely day down here in Lake Forest. I'm happy to be doing this with you virtually.
Likewise. It's a lovely Thursday.
Have you decided on what the topic might be?
So this week's topic, we're going to be talking about something that's pretty relevant with what's going on in the world right now. The reason why we're, working virtually with COVID. I think a lot of, small businesses, a lot of our clients, syndicators, having issues with working capital and how to, make sure that they have working capital to continue operating their businesses. So we're going to be talking today about capital calls, but really what we're going to be talking about is all the different ways that your company, your syndication can, increase your working capital or get some more cash into your operating account so that you could survive. That's the topic this week.
Capital calls. Okay, that's a good one. That's a good one. And I mentioned the timing, what we have with the virus and everything, but you and I have been around long enough to know that there are all sorts of reasons for capital calls. There are things called hurricanes that have destroyed properties that our clients have owned. We had one client where the manager actually died, and for a while we were in a little bit of trouble with cash distributions. So it is pretty important, and I think what we're going to see here, Jonathan, is the capital call itself is going to be the last thing we're going to talk about, because it's the last thing that our clients should really do on a well-drafted set of documents. And you don't want to be drafting your documents yourself, and we covered that in another podcast. But in a well-drafted set of documents, there are about 5 steps that are in there that you can deal with if, in fact, you're running short of capital. And this is a conversation that's both for the syndicators and the passive investors. They should read their documents and see what it says. The first thing I think you should do, and I think you agree, Jonathan, with the advice we give to our clients, is if you're running short of cash, postpone your distributions. The distribution section of your operating agreement gives the manager, the syndicator, the absolute right to determine what is available for distribution. We call it cash available for distribution. And it's a big, long definition. And basically it says it's whatever the manager thinks, looking at the past, looking at today, and projecting in the future, would be right to do for this quarter. And for the most part, these aren't real long-term problems we have. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, but you've got to protect the investment. The investors want you to protect the investment. They can go without a check. Most of the investors that invest in deals that we write, they can buy groceries if they don't get the check from this investment. So the first thing I would look at is your rights and your reasoning for canceling distributions. I would communicate ahead of time what you're going to do and give your investors a plan, but certainly that's the first thing you can do. So once you've done that, I think the operating agreement would go to where the manager has the right to go to third parties to borrow money, maybe getting a second mortgage, maybe getting some sort of line of credit, something where a third party outside of the company lends money and the manager has the authority to borrow that money, to give security, to sign a note, to negotiate the terms. What's some of the words that are going on today? Forbearance, postponing payments. the manager has the right to do that. And so between the cancellation or postponement of the distribution and the ability to go to third parties, I hope that most of the deals can be remedied, and most of the short-term cash deficiencies can be dealt with. But if we can't go to a third party, and we've already canceled our distributions, Jonathan, what's next?
So the next step that I guess a syndicator could do is they could loan the funds themselves, right? The manager, sponsor, the syndicator, our client can't get a third-party loan, then your next option is, if you have the funds yourself, you can loan the company your funds yourself in exchange for, obviously interest rate, right? You set the terms of the loan. We usually set it in the operating agreement itself, right? We put a cap on the amount of interest that you're allowed to charge as the manager.
I think that's real important.
Yeah.
So everyone knows when the manager loans the company money that it's been at a predetermined interest rate, a predetermined term, and Jonathan, it says that the manager is going to get paid back first before any distributions start up again, right?
I mean, it's treated the same as any other loan, right? So debt has priority over distributions to your investors. So that would be paid first if, once you're able to pay off the loan. But so do you have anything else to add about manager loans, manager advances, Gene?
No, it's important that it's in the document and everyone knows that you can do that. I do think one of the technicalities we're getting to, or we see, is what is the interest rate? The interest rate shouldn't be more than the preferred return. Just it looks poor.
Right. That creates
so I think
incentive
that
for you.
we're rating interest rates around 6% for manager loans. Isn't that typically what we're doing today, Jonathan?
Yeah, usually 6% in our documents. Okay. But I've seen some other amounts too. So
now there's no obligation.
Mm-hmm.
There's no obligation for the manager to make a loan or advance. And sometimes the advances or loans that the manager is making could very well be a forbearance on fees that they're owed. They could just say, well, I won't take the asset management fee, or I won't take the construction management fee. But let's put that all in writing. It's important that the manager and the company enter into a note with specific terms so that there's a paper trail. But Jonathan, what happens if the manager doesn't have any money, or doesn't choose? Because there's no. Yeah. That's one of the conflicts and the risks, is that the manager may have 4 or 5 deals that are running short of cash, and the manager doesn't have to give any money to any of them, or can pick and choose. Okay.
Yep.
So maybe the manager will just decide not to do it. So if that's the case, where do we go from there?
So the next thing that you could do is you could try to get a loan from one of your investors, one of the other members in the company. Oftentimes with some of the clients that I've worked with, they usually have like 1 or 2 investors that are kind of like the lead investor or whatever. So that person might have enough capital to loan themselves to the company. And it's the same thing as a manager loan, right? You have the interest rate that's set in the operating agreement that is predetermined, pre-negotiated, and the member has the option. Right? You're not forced to loan the company money, but you would go out to all your members and say, hey, we try to get third-party loans. I'm not able, as the syndicator, as the sponsor, as the manager, to loan the company money at this point. Are there any members here that are willing to loan the company funds? And again, the loan has priority over distributions, right? So if and when the company is able to make distributions again, they have to pay off the loan first before making the distributions.
That's important. That isn't really a capital call
Mhm.
per se. That's just going to existing people in the fund and borrowing money. And then it can be stated in the operating agreement what the terms are. Sometimes we do write clauses where it's negotiated um, member by member, and it's a note. One of the things that happens if it's a note is the person who's lending the money will get paid back first, and no one else's ownership percentages gets tampered with or gets destroyed. It's just simply a note, and it has preference for repayment. I've seen a couple times where some of the members don't like that. They want to know. Just recently, one of our clients called and said, "Where does it say in there that if a member makes a loan, they should get paid back first before all the other members get their cash distribution?" Well, here's a place where it'd be good to have read your documents, but we could tell them, what article that is in, and that would solve the investor's problem. So we've come down the line. One thing I forgot to say about distributions is, see, if you've got an agency loan on your multifamily property, Fannie or Freddie, there's clauses in your documents that say, if you can't make the mortgage payment, you're not making any distributions. They just absolutely put the clamps on distributions. And frighteningly, while we're talking about that, there are some lenders who restrict the ability for other loans to be placed on the property if there's any possibility that the repayment of those loans would put the principal and interest payment on the first trustee at risk. So you have to, if you're the syndicator, you need to read your loan documents, and you need to read how the operating agreement has been modified by the lender as we go forward there. So, Jonathan, we haven't come up to the big one now. We called this topic capital calls, and right now before this, we've been talking about liquidity. Right now, we're talking about a capital call. And that is when you go out and ask all the members to pony up and add additional capital over and above what they had originally invested. And it's a capital call, and it's made to all members. Now, there are a million ways of writing this. Jonathan, sometimes we write in our document for certain people in certain groups that the manager can't make a capital call, right?
They can't make a mandatory capital call.
Oh, that's right. There's that word, a mandatory capital call. Now, that's put in there to protect the passives. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder if that's put in there to protect the investment. That's just a side comment that I'm making. Why would you invest? Well, I know why you wouldn't want to invest if the manager had the absolute right to make a mandatory capital call. But why would you want to invest if the manager's hands were tied and we're in a bad situation and the manager can't make a mandatory capital call? And I think the second sentence is, the first sentence is probably, although we're trying to raise all the money we can, we might have a shortfall and there might be a need for new capital, and the manager cannot make a mandatory capital call, period. However, the manager can propose a capital call plan to the members. And if the members typically, what do we look for? What type of a percentage vote do we look for?
I think usually you put a majority, but sometimes our clients want like a higher threshold.
50 to 75% vote of the members, they can approve a plan submitted by the manager. And so here goes the manager putting on their thinking cap and saying, okay, how much do we need? How long will we need it for? what's going to happen if we can't pay it back? What's going to happen if everyone votes to do it, but no one does it? Because once again, unless it's voted on, it's not going to be mandatory.
Mm-hmm.
You want to, in the thought process as the manager, you want to get the vote to do the capital call because you need money. You need to understand that not everyone is going to be able to give you money at that time. So you don't want to put the word mandatory in there because you might not get the vote. And then you go back to the other things we just talked about. If the capital call doesn't work, then you got to go back and go back to the other three things and see if there's something you haven't paid attention to. But putting a provision that we should vote on a proposal is a good way to do it. Now, sometimes, Jonathan, I think we put in there, however, we're going to have a vote and here's the plan. So we've written the plan ahead of time and we've put it in there. And at that time, the members can vote on whether they want to go with that plan. And if they don't, we can write another plan, right? The manager always has the right to go to the members and say, well, you didn't like that plan, but I got another plan. And just keep coming up until you get a plan. So I think the questions that many members ask on this, well, if I vote for a capital call, but it's not mandatory and I don't put my money in, what happens to me? And I think the broad spectrum is, well, nothing happens to you. We'll just let the other people put in the money, and maybe what we just voted on is something more like a loan, okay? So no one's ownership interest gets reduced. The other side, the draconian side, is if you don't put in your money, you lose your investment. Well, fat chance that that's going to be voted on, right?
Yeah.
By the majority of the people. So, Jonathan, don't we usually see that, and I'm going to put numbers to it, if the investors invested $1 million to start with, and each investor would have a percentage of ownership based on their investment and the $1 million. Mm-hmm. And so let's say everyone put in 100,000. So everyone's a 10% owner. Now we need a capital call, and two people decide to put in the $500,000 that we need. So now we've got $1.5 million as the denominator. And then on the top, we've got two investors with 600 each and all the investors with 100 each. And you just recalculate their percentage, and we just change the exhibit, which talks about the investors' percentage, and we just go forward. Isn't that about the way it normally comes down, and the most common way we've seen, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think most people are familiar with dilution, and if new capital comes in.
That's the word.
Yeah, dilution.
That's the word, dilution. Now, so that's probably the most common, the most standard, and the one that would get voted on and approved the most. It is an opening for members who can contribute to help out the fund. It isn't too burdensome on the people who can't contribute, but we still want their vote, and we still want everyone to say yes. The only other one that I've seen is the new contribution comes in, and we create a different class of member for the new contribution, and the new contribution gets priority return. It's not a loan, okay, but it does get priority return. So maybe now we have Class C investors that put up the extra $500,000, and when the property sells, Class C investors get paid back before the other investors, and there's no dilution in the other investors as it relates to their initial investment. Kind of cumbersome, kind of awkward, but that's how you have to do it. Most of our offerings, as Jonathan said, don't allow the manager to do a mandatory capital call. Although I have one very good client who's done over 20 offerings, and they do a mandatory capital call. But they're working with a group of investors who like that. All their investors are accredited. Their initial investment is always a minimum of $100,000. So they're just thinking, if we're in trouble, we're going out and we're collecting the money from these investors. Depends upon who you're dealing with. Now, there's one other comment. We had a discussion with a client within the last couple of weeks who said something like, well, doesn't a capital call hurt your track record? Doesn't it hurt your reputation as a syndicator? Of course. Doesn't losing the property hurt your track record? Doesn't losing the property hurt your reputation? Of course it does. You at all times have to do everything you can to save the property, to save the investors' original capital. That's the goal. So you need to do what you need to do. And there are many situations that come up that we have to deal with. The issues we talked about, holding back the distributions, third-party manager advances, loans from individual members, and then the common capital call. And that's probably about all the time we have to deal with this topic, Jonathan. I've talked way too much. I'm sorry.
It's okay, Gene. I love listening to you talk because I feel like I learn something every time.
That's very polite. I don't think you have to say that, but maybe you do. Thanks very much.
Well, I mean, for the people that know me, I mean, they know that I'm a man of very few words. So I like to just get to the point and keep things as brief as possible. But
that's why we're a good team. That's why we're a good team. So why don't you wrap it up and take it home and tell them about next time?
Sure, yeah. So next week, stay tuned because the topic is TBD with TLG. Same every week. Noon Pacific time, Thursdays. I should probably say that in order. Every Thursday at noon Pacific Standard Time. So
I'll
see
be
you guys
sure to
next
be
week.
there. I'll be there.
Gene and I will both be there. So see you guys there.
Join us.